Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. Oh my God, we're so excited. We are continuing our series on structural care. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the other episodes or listen to them, I do recommend that you hang out for this one as we continue to understand how organizations can best care for their employees and take that burden away from the individual. So, we have today a guest. Anne Yurasek from Fio Partners is someone who uses staff surveys all the time. So if we're going to talk to somebody about staff surveys, Anne is the person, and she's going to tell us how staff surveys can benefit an organization, the what, the why, and the impact. Peter's going to help us understand why staff surveys are part of structural care. What does it all mean? So hang out with us for the next 30 minutes as we unpack what staff surveys are and how they can improve your organization. Okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Hey, you all know I love that jingle. I tell you, it never gets old. I just love listening to it. I dance behind the scenes. You don't see. Welcome. Coffee Time with Masterminds is I think I missed this, a 30-minute show where we talk about things related to nonprofit leaders and leadership. So welcome, Peter. How are you doing?
Hanging in there.
It's a little long. It's a little long.
I think everybody has a little bit of the winter COVID doldrums right now.
Yes. And I read on my my Facebook feed that this is week 100 of us being in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And this is our 84th show. And for those of you who have been with us for a long time, know that we started thinking we were just going to have a show for 6 weeks to talk about leadership during complex times. And here we are 100 weeks.
It turns out complex times are forever.
Complex times are forever. Definitely. We also have Anne Yurasek. Hi, Anne. How are you?
Good morning to you both. Great to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking about structural care for the past 5 weeks, and it started last year when we had quite a controversial show. It was called "I Am Mad About Self-Care," which Peter would tell you pisses her off. And we unpacked that, and she totally got me on her bus. Like, now people say self-care and I cringe. I'm like, no, structural care. So Peter, for our listeners, can you start with what is structural care and why is it so important?
Yeah. The reason that I initially was mad about self-care was that I thought it was inappropriately placing the burden on the individual to address structural problems, right? So if you are not paid enough, or you don't have health care, or whatever other thing is reducing your ability to thrive in your life, saying glibly, well, you should go meditate, right? You're right. You should be more at peace with the racism and microaggressions that you face at work by developing a meditation practice, right? It's inappropriate. It's wrong. It's us not taking responsibility for the environments that we create and how we're setting people up, right? And when I say we, I mean workplaces, I mean communities, I mean countries, right? There are a lot of things that we look at as individual issues that should not be individual issues. I am absolutely not knocking the things that people do that make them feel good, right? There is a range of self-soothing and self-care activities that are super beneficial. And if you enjoy them, you should do them. And if they're good for you, you should do them. But if you don't have time or space for yoga, right? Or you don't have expensive workout pants, that does not make you a self-care failure or a less good person. So.
Yes.
Yes, I love that. You're not a self-care failure. You had mentioned a couple of episodes ago, bell hooks turned
I think it's Audre
self-care.
Lorde.
Oh, Audre Lorde, sorry.
I misspoke. Yeah.
Turned
Yeah.
self-care as an act of resistance.
Yes.
I love that. I think about that all the time. That and I want to be friends with bell hooks. So if you're listening, please connect. Let's connect. Okay, so Peter, why staff surveys? Tell me how staff surveys fall into this umbrella of structural care.
Yeah. And let's take a minute to distinguish between the means, the survey, and the process.
Sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry about that.
I'll start again. So let's distinguish between the process, which is distributing the survey, and the information that we get, right? Which is some feedback about how people are feeling about their workplace and their work situation. Surveys are really attractive because, for logistical reasons, we think we can gather a lot of information relatively quickly. Some organizations think it's really important to gather this information anonymously, and give workers the opportunity to share maybe more candid feedback than they would otherwise. But the process of gathering information from your employees is an opportunity to see how you can address issues that might not be obvious, right? And develop strategies that can really help your workers.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And you use a lot of staff surveys. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what Fio Partners does. And then I'm interested in your driving philosophy around staff surveys. But tell us a little bit about Fio Partners.
Sure, and pleasure to be here to chat about this really important topic, really at this moment in time. So Fio Partners is a consulting firm that works with organizations really around strategic decision making. And this idea of staff surveys is really central to that strategic work. Because if there's anyone in an organization that deeply understands how the work of the organization should evolve, but also how the organization itself should change, is the staff in the organization. And so for every decision-making process that we engage in, it's about how do we actually center that staff voice and expertise in the process. And we do that a number of ways, but a staff survey is, as Peter pointed out, a great, easy way for people to share their opinions, to feel appreciated, to feel heard, and to maybe express the dissenting opinion or perspective that they haven't felt comfortable sharing either with a peer or directly with their supervisor. But in terms of the philosophy, Cynthia, it's about that expertise and ensuring that decisions made in the organization recognize that frontline experience and the day-to-day perspective of those who are working in the organization. I think we also have the opportunity in many ways that sometimes staff surveys, like much inquiry, can be extractive, right? Like, so we ask these questions, it's very hierarchical. I think increasingly we're thinking about how do we co-create staff surveys with staff? How are staff involved in the creation of the instrument, the distribution of it, making sense of the data that comes out of it, and really in some ways really thinking about sharing power in decision making with those in an organization where those decisions will most impact those frontline staff. So the philosophy is about shared power, where we can create it with organizations that are willing to kind of go in that direction.
Yeah, I love the idea about co-creating. And so there are organizations where staff do not complete staff surveys, or it's like pulling teeth. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think where we see really low staff response, we end up having really deep discussions about trust in the workplace. So either there had been a survey in the past where the data may have actually been used or perceived as being used against employees. We're aware of an organization that did some employee survey work, specific managers were targeted and given training to improve, even though the survey was said that it was anonymous, right? And so sometimes we enter into an organization and there's like survey post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, so we did that survey 3 years ago, all these bad things happened. I don't trust that my data or my opinion will actually be kept anonymous. So low response rates are
very careful about that. Even when the survey is completed anonymously,
correct.
There can certainly be enough identifying information in there to, identify a work group or something, and you've got to be really, really cautious about.
Absolutely. And oftentimes in that environment, we have to be very clear that if employees do raise what I call kind of an egregious issue, like as the third party provider, we are obligated to provide that information back to the organization. So if there's concern about trust, if there's concern about issues of employee relations within the organization, we oftentimes have to strengthen our disclaimers around, yes, please share your perspectives and voice. But if you actually raise a really substantive legal issue, we really are obligated to raise that with leaders. And so oftentimes we will feel as if we need to do that. We really work hard not to identify who it came from, but at least can raise the issue directly to organizational leadership.
Yeah. So even if an organization says we don't do staff surveys because no one responds, that alone is data.
That gives you a lot of information.
Tell us, Peter.
A lot of information. And I have had organizations say things like, oh, they're not going to, we have to distribute this anonymously. They're not going to trust that this is anonymous. Right. They're not going to have confidence in the data. At which point I would kind of say, I think that's all the data you need. You might not need to distribute this survey.
Well, and yet I sometimes say doing that survey again under a different context with some different commitments, can actually help to build trust, right? So if we're in that low trust environment, saying to a staff, we're going to do a staff survey. It's going to be open through the month of May. And then in June at our town hall meeting, we're going to tell you what you said, right? So you've got to be able to kind of signal if an organization wants to try to combat that low trust is like, what can we do to build trust through the staff survey? We can bring staff together and help design it. We can launch it. We can commit to telling people what the results are. We really encourage organizations to take the results into departments and programs and sort of say, well, what does this mean for us? What could we change on the ground, like immediately that responds to what we heard, right? Because what we start to realize is that, to your point, Peter, there are other structural issues. There also are small things that middle managers can do, that frontline staff can do. Like we can all contribute to healthy culture. And I think staff surveys can really get at some of those opportunities, right? So there's the structural organizational issues that need to be dealt with by management. But in that day-to-day, how are we interacting with each other across departments, across programs and services? So that responsibility for the whole experience is not only with leadership, but can also be supported by day-to-day staff too.
I spoke with an organization that did staff surveys, and they had their research department or learning, they called it their learning department, analyze the data. So they were charged with everything, so that the very staff who were being surveyed were also developing the survey. They were analyzing the data, and it wasn't a third party. And they had a pretty good response rate. So I think that also spoke to the trust, because sometimes bringing in a consultant doesn't help with the trust. It might actually widen the mistrust.
Yeah. Really depends on the organization, and sort of, certainly in the low trust environment, we definitely see sometimes people saying, I really want to use a third party vendor because it's that sort of neutral party outside the organization. But to your point, Cynthia, for larger institutions, there often is that research firm that internal research department that can help with that sort of data collection. And so again, I think it just depends on that culture of listening, the history of listening. Have we been listening for a long time? Is this the first time we've done a staff survey? I do often coach organizations that if they have not done a staff survey in a long time, be prepared. Like it's going to be a doozy, and that's going to be okay, because we have what we call no staff survey syndrome, where people have been at the organization for 8 years and like never been asked what they think. And so I often try to coach and kind of warn to say these initial results may be eye-opening, because people really have a lot to say that they've never been asked, and that's okay. And we have to normalize that and get comfortable with that. But at the same time, I do try to like help managers and leaders understand that the initial baseline results may be lower, in some ways, not because it's horrible, but because people really haven't been asked historically.
Yeah, we both had a reaction, by the way, when you said that. Almost need a support group for the leaders, because the leaders, and this is understandable, personalize it. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Leaders work really, really hard, and we're doing the best we can. And then we get this feedback, and it's a lot sometimes. And so, talk about structural care, right? Let's think about our leaders who are now going to take in this information, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, and helping them really make sense of it in a way that's productive.
We need to help people when these staff survey results come in, sort of deal with because there was absolutely that initial emotional reaction. It's that defensiveness. They'll get feedback that says, well, I'm not aware of the new benefits package. And you'll see some manager like knocking their head on a table being like, I sent 42 emails about the new benefit. How can they not know? Right. And so there's this like innate defensiveness that you start with, and then you just start to help people understand, help managers understand that what comes up in these surveys is people's individual reality, right? So you may have the perception that you've over communicated something, that you let information be known, that people could access it on the intranet. But when people still say they don't know, we've got to ask ourselves why, because that's their reality, right? And so perception is reality in these surveys, and managers need to move from a stance of defensiveness to that place of curiosity that sort of says, okay, we sent 42 emails. We posted it in the kitchen. Why do people not know that this happened, right? And so what is it about that unit, that department, that person's individual manager where the information or the communication isn't happening? And if I said, what's the biggest issue that pops up in staff surveys across all of them is communication, right? And so much of the stories we tell, the assumptions we have about our organizations are because of a lack of typically cross-department and program communication, but sometimes it's just communication overall. And how do we get people's attention to kind of critical organizational information? So that's a very big problem.
That there are logistical issues there, right? So you might have staff who are not sitting at desks, which means they don't even know how to access their company email. Like, it's just not an important part of their job. You have staff who work different shifts. And information is always communicated first between 9 and 5 when the leadership team is there, and the people who work overnight get it second and third hand. So there are things you can think through.
And never mind the fact that, to your point at the top of the show, like we're on week 100, which means there are some organizations that have stayed virtual the entire time, which means new staff have never been in the office. People have never met in person. And so, when we started to talk about this topic of staff surveys, part of it is organizations that have been in person or back in person or in and out, but there's this kind of sense of being in an office together. We have other organizations where people just haven't even seen each other in person in 2 years. And so this idea of culture, which we could say, that happens in an office, it happens in a program, it's happening on Zoom, right? And so if there were a time to be very curious about how staff are feeling, we've been adding kind of return to work sections of staff surveys. Like, are people really ready to come to work? Will people come back to work? We were chatting a little earlier about flexible work policies. Who's that going to work for? Should it work for everyone? I think if there were times where staff voice are important, it's right now, because really, not only has COVID disrupted work, I am on the fence that I think work may be disrupted forever. So we've got to really ask ourselves.
It's definitely disrupted forever.
What's the future of work? Like, what's the future of work for your organization? And realizing that staff can help co-create that right now. They can tell
Yeah.
you what's working for them. They can tell you what they need to be successful. And I think in so many ways we need to be creative about the way things, acknowledging the way things were and actually build the way things are going to be for the future and build that together. And so to the point about staff retention and staff voice and co-creating the future workplace and the future organization, if you aren't talking to staff today, I think there's a likelihood that they'll leave, because we also, as Cynthia talks about, that war on talent, so can I go to an organization that values my opinion about where we're going with the work, my role, my career? Am I feeling supported? And if I'm not in this day and age, hence the great resignation, I've never seen people move around in the nonprofit sector as much as I'm seeing
as much as they are right now.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry, Peter. What were you saying? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
a lot of what we're talking about really speaks to taking your time when you're doing a staff survey.
Yes.
We talked about, right, not just designing the survey and figuring out what you want to know, which I think that's where a lot of organizations start. I want to ask this question. But we've talked about creating the analysis plan, building buy-in, disseminating information, creating a communications plan around the whole project.
Absolutely.
Right? This open for 1 month survey is really a 6-month undertaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And letting staff know that.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I want to bring on the screen a comment from one of our viewers, which I think is really interesting. So Ma Nassau says, I am not sure staff surveys are for everyone. I personally say to myself, another survey?
Yeah.
However, I will say that surveys do provide concrete information and not information that is assumed. Yes, we haven't talked about that, but we definitely were chatting about that before the show. I use very little surveys with my social workers and guidance counselors because they're overwhelmed. And I do not want to overload them with another document for them to fill out. I believe that building relationships are more effective than a survey. I'm curious what you guys think about this, because I think leaders do. Here, let me get that off. I think leaders do worry about burdening their staff with just one more thing.
Absolutely.
And building relationships. But I also know leaders that have 600 people, 600 member staff. So that might be challenging. But what are your thoughts about, I don't want to burden my staff and not another survey?
I think it goes to what we were just saying about, it's on you as the leadership team or the consultants, right, or the group that is disseminating the survey to take it seriously. And 100%, if we're not willing to make that commitment to communicating well about it, disseminating information, and using the data, which we haven't really talked about yet, then you're right. You are just asking people to fill in another form.
Right.
Yeah. I'm one of those people that I like when people ask my opinion. I do surveys all the time. I volunteer. Now I'm going to get a lot of phone calls and emails, but I'm always up for a survey. I have a lot of opinions. I walk into a space and I'm always assessing how I feel in that space. And I love when people ask me my opinion, but I also have
consultants, right? So people will ask us our opinions and then pay us.
Right. But I don't like it when I'm being asked over and over again and nothing gets done.
Absolutely.
Right. And if you're not going to do something, at least tell me. Like if you're a CEO and you say, we got this survey and everyone mentioned, we got an overwhelming response about our paid time off. There's not something we can do about that this year. We will be talking about it with our board of directors next year. Say that, right? Say you're not going to do something. But to say nothing, I think is painful for staff. And that's when staff get exhausted.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about some of the other reasons that organizations don't do staff surveys.
Why?
They don't want to take action.
Yeah.
But I was going to raise one suggestion, which is Just to really acknowledge survey fatigue. If you are an organization that uses surveys all the time and you have really critical questions to ask, like what are alternatives ways that give staff voice, right? So we've talked a lot about like survey instruments, but I think it's a really good point to say that people are really overwhelmed. Is there another way? Is it, Peter mentioned earlier in our before call conversation, like adding a question to the payroll sort of checkout, or adding a question on your intranet, or just doing kind of one-on-ones with folks around a specific issue. Staff voice can really show up in a lot of different ways. A survey is a great, convenient, anonymous way to do it. But I think if we're focused on acknowledging people's opinions, getting them to share them with us, like we can be really creative about how that happens.
Yeah. I think I think in some cases we overstate the need for anonymity and preclude some creative options. So if people are physically in a space, I am all about using poster paper as a data collection tool.
Great idea.
Right? Like, how about candy polls, right? Let's put 2 options and then you put your Starburst candy in the bin corresponding with the thing that you think is a better option, right? Let's just put up a piece of poster board with a question prompt, what do we think would improve X, and let people write their comments on it. These are all ways that you could reduce the burden, maybe hear from some people you might not otherwise have heard from, and not be sending out another email with a task in it.
Right.
I love that. I love that.
And you could do the virtual versions is like send out a Google Jamboard, and it's a standing Google Jamboard, right? So if you're a virtual team, you could flip those up a little bit and just do the virtual version, which is, this is our suggestion page in Google Jamboard, and it has 3 questions on it. Get to it when you can, right? Like sort of low key ways to just reassure people that their opinions matter. I mean, that's what this is about. It's about voice, right? And so I think we can, to Peter's point, continue to be curious about how ways to do that.
I don't know if organizations do this anymore, but do you guys remember, or have you ever worked at an organization that had like the suggestion box?
I know.
Yeah, right.
Old school. It's great.
How are we doing with the suggestion box? That wasn't too successful. I always wondered who's looking at that.
Yeah.
And anybody could have taken it and stolen it. Like, I've never experienced that, but I always wonder, why isn't anybody just throwing this out in the garbage? What's the problem with the suggestion box?
Oh, it's a black hole. Like, to your point, where do those ideas go, and why don't we ever hear about them? I mean, I think there's a big aha in today's call and show, which is, don't ask unless you're willing to share that information back to people, and don't ask if you're not willing to take action. I mean, I think if you really want to piss everyone off, make them do a survey and then do nothing.
Don't do anything about it.
Really, take no action.
And that's one of the big reasons that organizations, don't do a survey, is they say, they start with an assumption. Well, we know everybody's just going to ask for more money. Right. And then they follow up with a, limiting and deficit-based belief. We don't have any more money. Right. And so we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And what they are precluding is, one, how could we get creative? Right. Like, what else could we do? Right. Or how could we take these results as an opportunity to be more radical in how we approach things, right? To reshape our budget.
Yeah. And so our viewer had talked about building relationships. Should we, when we're talking to staff, if we are intentionally trying to get specific information, should we let staff know and frame it in the sense of, we're going to do this survey and they're going to be one-to-one meetings? Or should leaders get used to constantly asking their staff and using this information as talking points for the next staff meeting? How do you?
I think the latter is probably better. I think, Anne raised that issue of doing that once in a lifetime survey where you ask about absolutely everything. You haven't asked anybody's opinion in you know, for at least as long as your current staff has been there. I have done this in plenty of organizations that had never done it before. And particularly with today's turnover, 2 years is the same as never, right? Nobody in an organization remembers if you did it 2 years ago. So it's the same thing, right? Then they have so much data. They did not make a plan for disseminating it. They did not make a plan for using it. They're just overwhelmed and they get stuck. I think one question at a time is probably a much better strategy, right? If we could just ask one question and then post the results, sort of like a poll on LinkedIn, like let's just instantly tell people what they said. And then let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
Right? That seems like a much more doable work plan.
Yeah. And I think, Peta, that builds trust. Asking, sharing, action. And for that, and I think that's an incredible model of leadership to show that feedback matters. I think that's incredibly important.
I love that. One question at a time. Okay. We obviously could talk about this for another hour. I mean,
we could talk about this for weeks. Yeah.
Yes, there is a lot to say. And what we hope is that leaders take away from this show this idea or a driving philosophy that staff surveys are important, but what's even more important is doing something about the feedback. And communicating what those actions are. And if you cannot follow through on some of those actions, also communicating that.
Communicate that too, right? Or talk about how this might be a long-term initiative for the organization, but it's going to take 5 to 10 years, and explain why, right?
Right.
People understand that.
So, well, thank you. Thank you to our viewers. Thank you to our guest, Anne Yurasek from Fio Partners. And thank you, Peta. Thank you for being you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.